Joining us this week on the show is the Eisner and Harvey-Award-winning comic book creator of titles like The Mice Templar with Brian Glass over at Image Comics, Thor: Blood Oath with artist Scott Kolins over at Marvel. He is also the sole creator of the Victories and is currently working on Blue Book with James Tynion over at Dark Horse Comics. And he has frequently collaborated with writer Brian Michael Bendis on titles like Takio, United States of Murder Inc., and the award-winning series Powers. More recently, he has been working on a brand new Dark Horse fantasy series called William of Newbury, which follows an anthropomorphic raccoon monk who seeks to rid the world of the undead and evil spirits. It is my honor to welcome Michael Avon Oeming onto the Oblivion Bar Podcast.
Hey, Chris. Thanks so much for having me, man.
Thanks so much for being here, Michael. And I think kind of to start off the conversation, I just have to ask, do you prefer Michael Avon Oeming or just Michael Oeming?
I prefer my full title. It's Sir Michael Avon Oeming.
Sir,
no, it's Mike is fine.
Okay, Mike. All right, because I know you're, again, as we said there in the intro, your frequent collaborator Brian Michael Bendis. It's always Brian Michael Bendis. Not Brian Bendis. I very rarely ever hear it. Just Brian Bendis.
That's funny. That's probably why sometimes we've gotten confused in the past with the two Michaels in there.
The three names. Well,
but I win because mine is first. It was Michael Avon Oeming. He's Brian Michael Bendis, so I got the most Michaels.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for being here. And, you've obviously already accomplished so much in your career thus far. My first question kind of centers around starting at the beginning. And my understanding is your love of comics as an adolescent is pretty closely tied to your love of mythology, specifically Greek mythology. And as we mentioned there in the intro, you've previously worked on Thor and Beta Ray Bill over at Marvel and even Ares over at DC Comics. Not to mention other series that you've worked on that sort of root themselves in the power of myth. So my first question for you is, why do you think you instantly gravitate to mythology? Or why do you think you instantly gravitated to mythology as a young person? And why has it remained such an important part of your storytelling today?
I think there's a couple reasons. One was because I hadn't discovered comic books in my younger years. So like my first sort of exposure to fantasy was through mythology, through like a few television shows and some movies. Clash of Titans would have been a big one. I was born in 73, so that came out in like 82 or 80 or something like that. So I was like just the perfect age for that. And then whenever I'd go to the library at school, the library books I was interested in were stuff like dinosaurs and the Greek myth stuff. And one of the reasons for that was because I was just always what I call an escapist. Like even from a young childhood mind, my brain was just always daydreaming and taking me elsewhere. One of my favorite activities in math was to break my pencil in half and then look at the broken pencil and imagine myself climbing up it, or that it was the castle spires or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So those combination of things always drew me towards mythology. When I discovered comics, one of the first comics I read was X-Men Annual 9, which was the Art Adams X-Men in Asgard stuff.
Okay.
So like suddenly those two things fused in my head. I was, you can have superheroes and mythology at the same time. And at that point too, I only knew of mythology in this most abstract way. I hadn't even separated that the Romans and the Greeks were different and, what exactly was going on with mythology. I hadn't read any of the Joseph Campbell stuff. Years later, I was introduced to Here with a Thousand Faces and a bunch of Joseph Campbell's work and other people's work who would talk about how mythology isn't just these old stories, but that they're stories that reflect our humanity and society and how we've grown or haven't grown. And since those times, I just really locked into the whole thing and was studying it. Luckily, and this is a good thing, I think, when I was writing like Ares and Thor, while I had... Well, at that point with Thor, I had a lot of studies of the Norse mythology in mind. The Greek mythology stuff I wasn't as deeply entrenched in, which in a way was good because it didn't allow any of that stuff to get in the way of telling a Marvel-style comic book. Mm-hmm. If I was to do it now, I'd have a lot of conflicts of like, this thing that happened in this story meant this thing, and it doesn't translate well. Like I had Achilles showing up in Olympia. Like he was never like ascended to godhood and stuff like that. And like I kind of want to stay true. I grew in a way that I wanted to stay true to the source materials the older I get. In fact, I have Greek mythology stuff that I want to get to next after I finish about 2 or 3 other graphic novels ahead of me. And those are very much sticking to the sources, to the source material. So that's kind of my journey with mythology stuff, and it still deeply affects what I write now. Mythology ties deeply into history as well. So I've become kind of an armchair history nerd, very much into archaeology, into, you know, when and where the culture is developed. Fascinating thing recently was learning about like the Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean area, and really finding out that it wasn't a collapse in the way that we were taught that it was. It was basically rich people's society fell apart, but like the rest of society was going on just fine. You know, people were still farming and all of this stuff, and yeah, there were wars and there were some ecological disasters and stuff, but like, you know, it was really interesting is learning about how history is read and how we're told these stories and sort of the context in which they're told. And then finding out to dig deeper and find out more of the truth is fascinating. With William of Newbury, one of my favorite things was just learning more about the monasteries, learning about medieval time periods and the stories that aren't written down. Like anything that you study, a lot of times you'll run into sort of the same themes and the same stories over and over again. And just like comic books, like if you want to learn more about the B, the C, and D characters, you have to dig a little deeper. So what was really interesting to me was finding about the details of the monasteries and the people that were in the monasteries. And there was like some shocking stuff that was fascinating. I couldn't wait to put into the stories, and to just sort of learn about how different a lot of that was from what we assumed from the many sort of cliches and conventions, most of which are actually true, you know, but like there's more to it than that, right? So it's been a real joy learning more about medieval history, and then working that into the stories where I find it appropriate, and discarding it where, you know, the narrative has to take precedent.
What I find really hilarious and sort of embarrassing is that in my question, I said Greek mythology, and what I meant was Norse mythology. So I appreciate you maneuvering that question appropriately. But and kind of along with that,
that's okay. I mean, there was both. Yeah, the Ares series was Greek mythology.
Yeah.
And then the Thor stuff obviously was Norse. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just looked it up as you were talking about that X-Men Annual #9. So it looks like it came out in December of 1985. And is that an homage to the What If Jane Foster cover from earlier?
That cover?
Yeah. Yeah, it looks like it's got
the Art Adams cover. I think it's an homage to Jack Kirby's Thor #1.
Oh, you're right. That's what it is. See, I had like a homage in my head, but I couldn't remember exactly what it was. And I think that cover also is homaging Jack Kirby's, you know, iconic, you know, Thor cover.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that book had so much going on in it. And it was really the thing. It wasn't just the mythology, but Art Adams' art is why I wanted to become a comic book artist. Up till then, I was just kind of like tracing some comics and really interested in it and stuff. But like seeing Art Adams' work just hit me like this sort of lightning rod, you know. And it really, really that's the moments when I really realized what I wanted to do. Like this was it. And then ironically, in that issue is, you know, while you won't see much Art Adams influence my work today, it was for many, many years. But also in that issue was the person's work who's influenced me the most, which is Mike Mignola. He inked some of that issue. So I had been a fan of basically anybody in those early mid 80s time period at Marvel whose art stood out, because at that point the Marvel house style sort of was eating itself, where it was like an imitation of Jack Kirby being imitated by John Buscema, being imitated by 6 other people, and like it all got kind of watered down, right? And there was this handful of dudes like Rick Leonardi, Art Adams, Mike Mignola, Michael Golden, just a few people who were standing out style-wise. And so Mike's stuff I was a fan of the moment I saw his name in that book, and I found his other work, and this is long before it turned into what it's turned into today. I was hooked into his work and just paying attention to it and learning lessons.
It's funny you say that, because I was just reading some Amazing Spider-Man. I want to say it was around the 100 issues and it's Len Wein and Marv Wolfman on the book. And what you're saying about how everyone's sort of trying to emulate that house style. And that is so it's pre the Marv Wolfman that we know to eventually become Marv Wolfman, the legendary, comic creator. And as I'm reading it, I'm like, is he trying to just do, that classic Silver Age look? It just doesn't look like his style. So it's funny to hear you kind of speak on that now.
Yeah. I mean, and that happens all the time. People are going to look back. Well, we look back at the 90s, right? Mm-hmm. And the Jim Lee thing became like the house style for everything, right? In some variation. And it's really odd looking back. There are artists who weren't working that style who, not to no fault of their own, if they wanted to continue to be employed, they had to start doing the cross hatching and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. You can look at these different time periods and you can see these different movements happening. And they're going to look back now and they're going to look at whether it's my work that's been influenced by Mike and a handful of other artists who have, or they'll look at the way digital inking has affected a lot of the books and a lot of the looks and color holds and, all the tools that we have at our hands right now are creating a scene that we won't even be aware of until much later. And we'll look back and we'll go like, oh yeah, I remember when everybody was painting noses red. Okay, yeah, that was like from 2010 to 2017.
Yeah.
And then the red noses disappeared for some reason, and they moved on to this other thing, and yeah, it's really interesting. Like comic book history is full of these kind of these moments of like whether it's style, the way people were approaching their stories, the way decompression when Powers came about, the storytelling of decompression really grew and became a thing, and then there's been a pushback against it, and then there were times where thought balloons were everywhere, and then thought balloons disappeared, and now I think people are starting to see a good balance of it now, of like when to use the thought balloon and when to use captions, and I find all that fascinating because you never see it when it's happening, you always see it afterwards. Yeah.
Well, speaking on mythology, we're kind of circling this idea. And I want to get into your latest endeavor, which is, of course, like we had just already talked about over at Dark Horse, William of Newbury. And at the time of this recording, the first issue is already available at your local comic book shop. And issue 2 is set to be released on June 26th. This series is currently being built, and we kind of already alluded to it. Mike is holding it up right now into the camera. And go pick it up if you haven't already, that first issue.
I just picked it up. Yeah.
Yeah. How does it, real quick, before I go into the rest of my question, how does it feel to hold that in your, like when you get one of the series that you've been working on for a while, to get that physical copy in your hand, how does that feel?
Well, here's a really disappointing answer, but I think it's pretty common. I immediately am just looking for what's wrong.
Oh, sure.
Now, first, I am super proud of this book. Like, I really am. And it's such an exciting feeling to have it out because this is different for me on a lot of levels. One, that I did everything. I wrote, I colored, even lettered it. Worked really close with my editor, Daniel Chabon. People at Dark Horse were great on it. I want to point out the work of Hannah Noble. She did all the design work inside of the book. When you pick this up and you see what, like, I didn't give them any direction. It's one of my favorite things about working with Dark Horse. I gave them no direction, and it was like Hannah was reading my mind. She knew exactly what was appropriate to design for this book, and I'm really happy with that. But then what I do is I look in and I look, well, what line work held up well? When did I use a pen here and I should have used a brush? When did I use my Uniball pen versus using my Micron pen? When did I use a color hold where I didn't go far enough where the color is not strong enough and it's too close to black and stuff? So that's the main thing that I do. And then I see all the tangents that I didn't see when I was like finishing up the line work, where an object is too close to another object, so it looks like it's unnaturally connected. I will say I'm still super happy with it. This is the most happy I've been with a book probably ever. So I'm just, I'm just really ecstatic with it. But yeah, that's the first thing you do as an artist, is you look to see what's wrong. Not so much to kick yourself in the teeth, but it's to learn from, right? Mm-hmm. Hopefully, because it doesn't do any good now. It's published, so like, oh, okay, this is good, but it would have been better if, and then hopefully you can remember that when you're actually tackling something else.
I don't know. I don't think I need to be the first to tell you this. I'm sure I won't be, but this is a great looking book. It's a great read just in general, a great first issue. And, we were kind of talking about this a moment ago in that first question, but this is sort of being billed as a mixture between Usagi Yojimbo and Hellboy, which in my opinion is spot on. I think there are some panels in this first issue that it has that Mignola sort of flair to it, which I really love. It's kind of a good mixture of both of your guys' styles together. And I've heard you note that the core of this story is sort of loosely based on the 12th century civil war between England and Normandy called the Anarchy. So my question for you is, what was it about this time period and William specifically being a monk, sort of monk crusade, that fascinated you?
So this is actually, I think this is a really good story because I have to kind of go backwards through it. So this actually started with Blue Book, which I'm doing with James Tynion. In the back of Blue Book, he was doing these series of stories called True Weird, which were just weird stories through that are supposedly true. One of my favorite odd stories was always called this thing called The Green Children. And this happened during the 12th century. Basically, the short version of these two kids showed up out of nowhere, and their skin is green and their clothing is green, and they speak a weird language. So that people are just thinking that they're fairy children. Somehow they came out of a fairy world. During the 12th century, this wasn't something that was unbelieved, So, and they didn't recognize the food. They're very strange. One of the children dies. The other child grows up and is speaking English and stuff. And as she gets older, she tells a story about how she's from this other place called St. Martin's Land, which had a lot of commonalities with this sort of inverted fairy world where there's churches, but there's not Christ or stuff. And it's just this weird stories. And that was sort of the story. Now, the story comes from actual historic writings. One of the writers who wrote this story down was William of Newbury, also known as William of Newbury. So then when I was doing this research for the story, I learned more and more about this writer, William of Newbury, or Newburgh. But we'll stick with Newbury because it's just dependent on what part of the country you're in, how you pronounce his name. So as I'm reading more research on him, not only did he write down this story, he had written England's first histories. It's called The Chronicles of England or something. I always forget the name of it. But it was England's first official history that he had written down. But in this history, which covers this time period called the Anarchy, which is when Queen Matilda, who was supposed to be the Queen of England, the first Queen of England, she was supposed to inherit the England from her father. I think it was Henry. Of course, everything was super patriarchy, even more so than now. And so they're like, a girl ruling us? No way. And then this distant cousin named Stephen was like, well, I'll be the king. And then it was literally like 30 years or something like that of anarchy where nobody was really in charge. And, there were wars back and forth, and there were divisions amongst who the landowners were backing and who they weren't. And it was pretty nuts. But in this actual very real history, he's also recording stuff like the dead coming back to life and demons and ghosts and stuff. Not as folklore, but, right next to these other accounts. And over in Berkshire, this thing happened and this priest came back to life. Because they were living in a time period where this stuff was very much real. So why question the stories, right? So I'm reading the stories, and then I'm reading that there are 3 or 4 different accounts. And there's a whole bunch more stories. But what I discovered was, some of them kind of had these same themes and stuff. And it all came to me it just dropped in my head like a brick. I was like the whole story came together. Take the Green Children and tie it in with these other very real stories they tell. So all the stories in here, the first issue is, what is the title? I think I know this stuff, right? I have terrible recall. The very first title is called A Serious Nuisance in Buckinghamshire. That's the name of one of his stories. That's what he called it. So all of the stories in here are actual historic retellings of things that he recorded. Some of which are toned down for various reasons. There's a lot more blood and gore and some assault and stuff like that involved with demons and ghosts, and it gets pretty nuts. So I felt like the whole story was a gift. Sometimes when you're doing research, you'll just get the whole thing all at once, and you become sort of a story archaeologist where you're just uncovering, you're just taking things away because the story is already there. So that's the long about story. How this came about was through another story. I discovered who William of Newbury was, and then discovering the other things that he wrote about. Other historians were jokingly calling him like the first vampire hunter, right? Like he never left the monastery, but he was recording all these stories. And yeah, it was all fascinating and all felt like a gift just waiting to be retold. And I'm hoping that this series does well enough with the support of everybody out there that we can do more stories. And while they'll always involve like the supernatural element, they'll also involve more historic elements as well. Like I want to get more into this sort of anarchy period and what was happening between Matilda and Stephen. And there's a bunch of other history that's really interesting to pull in.
I think that I find that so interesting, and I really revere that about your work, is that you have this sort of curiosity and fascination with these, like, so again, to kind of go back to the question I had earlier, like the myth of it all and sort of the text. And as you're sort of describing all of this right now, all of that from the anarchy period, in that 12th century, it reminded me of Game of Thrones a little bit. Is there any connection there at all between George R.R. Martin and his work too?
Oh yeah, I mean, George talks like he's my friend. George talks about this all the time. But
first name basis of George.
Of his plots. Yeah, he takes a lot of his plots directly from history. In fact, the House of Dragon, the current one, House of Dragon, is completely based on the anarchy. Because what happens in the anarchy is, one of the kings, he passes away, and what does he do? He names his daughter to be the successor. So there's a fight over succession. So this is very much, so it ties in a lot to, it doesn't tie to Game of Thrones, but it ties into the same source material. Because as you know, like, truth is stranger than fiction. There are just some of the craziest stuff can happen in history that is almost too real to make sense. And these stories are just full of it. Stuff like the Red Wedding, that came right out of history. That was a real thing. You read about the story of the Plantagenets, which were like sort of the French families who are fighting with the English families, and it's all there. What's interesting is this time period, the anarchy has been the centerpiece of a bunch of different retellings of history and fiction. So it's not just Game of Thrones and William of Newbury, but like there's a series of books called Cadfael, about Brother Cadfael, which is like this. This was a big influence on me as well, as he's a kind of like Name of the Rose. He was a monk who was like a detective character. And those stories are all set and take place during the anarchy. And you can watch some of this like on Amazon right now. I think it's free to watch. It's good quality stuff. And there's a series of other books. The Pillars of Earth, I think, is one, which is also a television series. And that takes place, I believe, during the anarchy. Yeah, it's all over the place, man. It's just a gift that keeps on giving,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and kind of the other
history and mythology is like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the kind of the other central pillar of William of Newbury, and the kind of the other central theme that I wanted to discuss was the anthropomorphic storytelling that is currently on a hot streak currently in the media. Like you've got Animal Pound, you've got the aforementioned Usagi Yojimbo, Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees, Feral, exactly. Just to name a few, right? And what I find so fascinating as humans is that we're the only species in existence to share and discuss ideas in the form of storytelling, which sort of in itself is anthropic. So I say all this to ask this: why a raccoon for your central character?
Well, it's funny. The raccoon. So this goes back to the Mignola. A lot of this goes back to my Mignola influences. One, for some reason, I felt like if I drew this straightforward as a monk, it would just feel too much like a like a Mignola verse book that should have been, right. Like, and for as much as I'm a fan of Mike's and I like to work with him. We're doing a BPRD thing and some other stuff. I don't want to step on his toes too much. I'm self-conscious of, the amount of influence that I have. So I felt like, all right, if I take the people out of it, that'll be half the battle to make it a little more me. And then initially it was going to be a fox, because a fox is often just a fun character to go to. But Mike had also drawn several sort of anthropomorphic fox-looking characters, not in stories, but like just these drawings that I so couldn't get out of my head. All I was doing was drawing Mike's fox, and I was like, I don't want to do that either. Now, even though Mike was known for Raccoon, that was one of his early stuff, that imagery it wasn't burned into my eyeballs the way this fox head was. So that was one of the reasons he became a raccoon. But also, the animals, as soon as you do anthropomorphic stuff, you ask yourself, why is this anthropomorphic? You don't always need a deep answer. Sometimes I just like cute animals and stuff, right? But as soon as I asked myself that, it started to do my favorite thing in writing, which is to put up barriers and limitations. I find when you have limitations to your writing or your art, you become laser focused on why you're making the choices you're making. So one of the first things I realized is these are just people. Like all the animals are just people. Like nobody will refer to anybody else's tails or ears or anything. I wanted to create a world where I could say a little something about what I feel about true human equality. Like often we talk about equality, we're talking about like opportunity and stuff. But I think it goes deeper than that. We're talking. I want to show that, and I don't want to go too spiritual, whatever. But like on some spiritual level, like we are all so completely even, no matter who we are or what our backgrounds, what we've done, even like our value as humans equal us out. Like, and I don't want to use the metaphor that we're animals, right? But there is this sort of metaphor here that everybody here is animals. And when you see spirit versions of people, when they're dead or they're saints, they're human. You know, so it's sort of my way of saying that everybody here is human. And, you know, we're at this sort of base level here on Earth trying to struggle. There's a larger part of ourselves that is this larger spiritual thing. So when you see ghosts and saints, like even in the churches have human saints on there. When there are even the demons will show up as in human form. There are angels who show up in human form. And like I don't want to get into it too deeply because it's not like a hard set of rules, but it's this loose metaphor that I found while doing the anthropomorphic stuff. And that's part of the gift of working with anthropomorphic animals. You're asking yourself, why are you using this and not using that? I also, like, I loved stuff like Wind in the Willows, Watership Down, Secret and Nim were all big influences on me. And those are full of really cute, furry mammals. So there's a cuteness that runs through this, but it's not about being cute, but I don't want to discard that. So like all the main animals here, you'll notice are like furry, cute mammals, right? But then that put limitations on like who I can represent as animals. Also, this is a medieval period where that sheep is such a huge part of medieval time periods. You know, how do I not have sheep and stuff? So you have to get these weird things where there's like, you know, there's no horse animals or horse people, but there are raccoons riding a horse, you know, and that's very purposeful. There are no sheep as characters, but they will own sheep. You know, I don't know what I'm going to do about cats because at one point I realized I need to have cat and dog as people. And with the dogs so far, it's the only one where there's dog people and then there's just dogs. And it gets kind of funny, but it all sort of ties into a very loose metaphor that makes the story run deeper, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I find it so interesting whenever creators like yourself can tell the most human stories with those anthropomorphic animals, right? I think some of our best sort of humane stories, you know, where we sort of dissect and analyze humanity is told through the lens of, you know, a story that's centered around animals, right? Like I'm thinking a lot of the Orwellian stories of the world, and you know, Moss is a good example.
Animal Farm, right?
Yeah. Yeah, even like Moss, the you know, everyone's favorite, you know, everyone read it in high school, right? Talking about a lot of the stuff from the, you know, the early 20th century. Yeah. So I just find that really interesting, and I can't really implore people enough to check out William of Newbury because I think you do an incredible job of sort of setting up this world without setting, like you had just said a moment ago, setting too many boundaries to where you can still play with a lot of it going forward. And I know this is only set to be 4 issues, but I would imagine if people are really excited about it, and if you're really excited about it, we could see more. And to set those hardcore boundaries would be sort of limiting it like right out the jump.
Yeah, and I'm just straight out asking people, just let Dark Horse know that you want more if you're enjoying this. Like, I would like to do a miniseries a year. Like, I would like to just have it keep going. I've got a lot more stories to tell. I've kind of got them blocked out, at least for like three complete trades would be great, you know, because I can see a sort of progression of the characters in the story. I absolutely love it, and I hope people are enjoying it, and that we can do more.
Mm-hmm. And, we talked about, you mentioned this earlier, and I want to highlight it very specifically. I think it's important to note that you are doing everything, like you said, writing, drawing, lettering, inking, coloring, the whole shebang. And here at the Oblivion Bar, when we talk to folks like you, we like to call you guys an artist with a capital A. And collaboration is so important in the medium. I know you know this because you've worked with Brian Bendis many times, right? And seeing, more singular voices in comics it's becoming more and more apparent as time has gone on. With notable works like The Victories and Dick Tracy Forever, this obviously is not your first stint tackling a series alone, but what have you found is the most challenging part of working on a series solo?
I mean, this is actually the first time I'm doing a full series alone.
Okay.
So I wrote and drew The Victories, but I did have Nick Filardi was coloring it.
Mm-hmm.
My wife Takio was coloring Dick Tracy, and other people were lettering and stuff. This being the first time was great. Like, these are all little skills that I built up over time. But being able to do it all together, I learned so much more about the other steps, especially. And what's funny is those steps go back to the writing and to the art. So in coloring, there's storytelling in coloring. So when you change a scene, it should feel different. If the scene is something that's scary versus something that's lighthearted versus something that's dreary, like, you can tell that story in the colors, not just by using nice colors, but by using colors that are specific to a mood. Learning how to do that on a deeper level with this was a big lesson. But the really big lesson was lettering. I had always just done lettering in a sort of functional way before when I had to do it on one or two of my own sort of stories. But I learned much more about writing through lettering than ever before. I wish that every writer would learn to letter, even if it's not for publication, because once you do, you learn a rhythm to the writing. You learn how much space that there really is in a panel. You can start to instinctively feel it after a while. Like, I'd start writing scripts after lettering the first issue going, oh, I can tell there's not enough space in here for this. Even though, like, I will always leave space, almost like somebody once called my storytelling like a puppet show once, where there's like the head is always mid-level and there's all this space up above because I just leave it there all the time, like a puppet show. And a lot of my photos too, usually there's a bunch of space over my head that I leave for the lettering. But even with space like that, sometimes there's just not enough space. I learned pacing wise as lettering it myself. Like, there's no hard rule about this, right? And I've been in, like, Brian Bendis' teaching class and his master class, where he talks about, people will ask a question like, how much lettering can go on a page? How many words can fit in? And there's no magic thing. But if you start lettering, you will learn your own sort of pacing for this. And one of the little tricks that I learned was every panel basically comes in 2 and 3. And it's either one person has 2 lines and then the other person has 3 lines. That's kind of as much as you can get, or it goes back and forth a little bit. The more you stretch it out, the harder it's going to get. So, like, each panel at most has 5 sentences in it. That's a thick panel too, with a lot of words. So I learned to rewrite. So I'm rewriting as I'm lettering. So it's like, as I'm lettering, not only lettering for space, but now that I can also see beats and timing that I had in the art that I wasn't thinking about when I was writing it. So now I'm reverse engineering it so that I'm fitting, not just fitting for space, but like, it would be better if this sentence was cut in half now because of the expression on this character's face. It's going to carry a different subtext than before. That was just the best lesson out of all this. Was in the lettering. It really changed my writing a lot. And I'm going to try and just letter everything I do in the future. I might get a professional letter to do the sound effects at very least, though, because if you notice all my sound effects, I'm just using the exact same font for everything. And one of the reasons for that wasn't out of laziness, but it was, again, setting boundaries on myself. So it helped laser focus what I was doing, using the limited tools I had in lettering to just do that one thing correctly instead of trying a whole bunch of different stuff where it didn't, I could fumble, right? Mm-hmm. So lettering, it was just the best blessing in doing everything in this process. Like, it taught me so much about my own writing. And whenever I do teach classes or talk to other creators about this stuff, I'm going to say, so learn to letter your own stuff. Even if you're not a professional letterer, it will change how you write.
You actually provide a foom in that first issue, which I really appreciated. I loved that sound effect that you had in that first issue. And of all those steps that we've talked about, the writing, lettering, coloring, everything, which did you find your least favorite, I would say?
It started with the lettering, but I don't have a least favorite thing in the process anymore. I think maybe it's just in the lettering, the sound effects thing. Like, I know I'm doing a disservice to real letterers out there who understand there's like deeper levels of lettering than I can accomplish doing myself, right? Like there's a whole school of thought about like, when does a word balloon bump up against a panel, right? So that it like has that like right hand corner to it. When does it overlap a panel? How long should the tails be? When is it too long, right? Like, when are you cheating in this sort of stuff? Like, so there's another level of professionalisms that letterers like Ajija Badekar on Blue Book understands that I don't. So I feel bad in that way, that I'm not doing the service that a professional letterer would really do. But I'm hoping, with time I'll get better. So that's the only thing that feels bad in a way. It's like, I know that there are people who could do this better, but doing this also serves me as the writer. So it's a weird balance of stuff.
Have you had Taki come up behind you?
But actually, I mean, I also love.
I was like, do you have Taki come up behind you and critique you
everything.
as you're doing everything?
With everything, but like in a good way. Like, this is our language. Our love language is writing, storytelling, clarity. The other thing besides lettering that changed my writing, that really changed it to the point where it's like the 9/11 in my writing, where like there are things that happened before and there are things that happened after, right? I'm Gen X, I can say that. And that was when she wrote her book, Sleeping While Standing. So she's telling her life story in her biography called Sleeping While Standing, and she chose to do it, and each chapter is 4 pages or less. Now, you can imagine the stories that she went through. Some of these stories could be a graphic novel in themselves. So she had to figure out like what to leave out. What was a story really about? Who are the main characters? Who are really the main characters? What is the story about? You ask a writer what their story is about, they'll tell you often that they're about these several different things. And I was a person like that. But when you've got 4 pages to tell a story, it becomes like an onion with no layers. Like, she just peeled off every layer until she'd be like laser focused on what the point of the story is, so that like every sentence ties into that larger point, taking characters out who are there in real life but aren't additional to the point of the story, right? So that kind of laser like focus editing changed the way that I wrote, and ever since then, like even before that, but especially after that, we really break down everything. We go through this painful but beautiful thing of like, every script I write or she writes, we read it out to each other. The other person who didn't read it writes it, so you get like their first reaction. You can hear them stumbling over words, or when they're pausing because something might not have made sense, or they get lost and stuff. And all we have to do is throw our ego out the window. So it's never about, well, you read it wrong, or well, what I meant to say was so and so. Because if you have to explain what you meant to this other person, you've already lost. You've already screwed up, right? Now, you still have the choice for yourself to go, even though they didn't get it, I still am confident that this was the right blah, 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 right? But that's our whole life. Like, every show we watch, we tear it apart in the best possible way. We'll finish shows that we don't like, just talking about why it didn't work, and we have so much fun with it, and it might sound like arguing sometimes, but it's not. It's just, we're just passionate about like the story that we're watching and why it worked and why it didn't work. Commercials, we'll watch a commercial and be like, what was that about? And I don't know what that was about. We'll go, oh, like, I hate commercials, but that was good. Like, they caught my attention. I know what they're talking about, because all of that is about clarity, right? Mm-hmm. Storytelling is about clarity, whether it's the images, the coloring, the lettering, in this case, or in the case of comic books, all these things put together, working in unison to, clearly tell a story. So yeah, that is the language of our life. It's just constantly talking about stories. So like, yeah, the lettering, there were times where she was like, yeah, this is just too many words. Like, I fit them on there, but she could be objective enough to go, you're asking a lot of the reader. This is one of those pages where you turn and you go, ugh, right? So how do you say more with less words? Which becomes this great puzzle where you're trying to figure out how to say something with less words. So you're looking for words that are either adjectives or other exclaimers or descriptors that say more about what you're trying to say than the sentence does. And when you can find 1 or 2 words that says more than a full sentence, it is so rewarding. It's such hard work, but we're like literally high-fiving each other because we figured out, how to say more with less. Anyway, I could go on and on about it. There you go.
I envy your guys' fellowship and your I would say security as well, in the way that you guys approach creativity and everything. And I mean, that sounds like the ideal creative relationship in my opinion. And so to kind of build off that, Michael, I kind of have one final question for you here. I wanted to briefly highlight your upcoming Kickstarter, The After Realm. You're getting it all collected into one edition.
Thank you.
And now this is a creator-owned series you published through Image Comics with artist Sean Lee and again Taki Soma in 2020 through Image Comics. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how this Kickstarter process has been for you, and what has it been like for you to return to this story for the upcoming campaign?
The Kickstarter process was at first just very intimidating for a lot of reasons. One, you're consciously trading out a smaller audience for a direct connection to the audience. When you can sell more through the direct market, but there are all these sort of trade-offs. Some of them are economic, like the fact that I can do a story through a Kickstarter or any other sort of crowdfunding process, and it mitigates my risk. Will the book make money? Well, I can set the budget to make sure that it does. And you can tell it any kind of story that you want. You can tell a story that wouldn't work in the direct market because, it can be too idiosyncratic, or, this was a story I was sort of exploring as I was doing it. So that was all exciting. And then the other thing is I learned very quickly how much more of an intimate experience it is with your readership. So your readers are getting the book directly from you. And even though I have a filler who helps me send stuff out, because that's a huge part of the process that's really difficult, I'm communicating directly with the people. We have a message board and they're telling me, oh, maybe the project didn't get to them. They ordered the book but didn't show up, and they're getting it directly from me. And so I could send them something extra. Artwork and stuff is being sold, through the Kickstarter. So it is just much more of an intimate relationship. It is rewarding in ways that the direct market isn't always. It is a smaller audience, but this is all a positive trade-off. And it's going to be a major part of my future publishing plans. I'm going to be doing both, working with the direct market. I'm also going to be working with more crowdfunding stuff, because some of the stories, they're weird stuff that doesn't have an outlet for it. So, but there's always fans that will find you and find your work. So thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, we're going to launch it a week or two after the first issue of Newbury is out.
Awesome. I just offhandedly mentioned today, I was at my local comic book shop that I was speaking to you tonight, and they had actually I had this question already ready to go for our conversation, and they had mentioned The After Realm and how they got the first 3 issues and were like, I don't know what happened. I know there were more issues, but what's going on? And I was like, oh, they're doing a Kickstarter, and they were so excited by that. So I know there's going to be excitement for this. And I even looked before we got on this conversation now, you've already got close to 200 people ready to go, ready to back this thing immediately. So I know this is going to be a successful thing.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's 300 pages long, because I did every issue was double-sized issue, and there were 5 issues of it. Then I drew another 20 pages of just additional material. There's 3 brand new stories in there. And then there's also 50 pages of material. So yeah, I'm really excited that people are there for it. 'Cause I don't get out very much. We don't get to do too many conventions and stuff. So I have no idea how well or not well this stuff is going to do. And social media is so strange anymore. Trying to get your messaging out is easier and harder than ever before. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I really appreciate all of the support and hear from that retailer as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think in the future, once we eventually get that Kickstarter live and out there for everybody, I will include a link in the show notes. So if you're listening to this sometime in the future, I will either include the link for the Kickstarter or I'll include the link for the direct to buy. So regardless, you can check the show notes as you're listening to this conversation with Michael to order that at some point. So Michael Avon Oeming, Mr. Oeming, all the Sir Michael, all the things we decided today. It's been an absolute blast having you here on the Oblivion Bar podcast this evening. As a longtime fan of yours, after initially being exposed to your work while reading Brian's Ultimate Spider-Man as a kid, I just absolutely love seeing your work on things like Blue Book, and of course now with William of Newbury. And I'd absolutely love to have you back on the future to discuss anything that you're working on at that time.
100%. I'm always working on several projects at once. So working on a BPRD thing right now. Brian and I have a new book. We're working together, and there's 3 issues in the can. Got new books coming out next month. So yeah, I'll be happy to come back anytime.
One small question before we go. Any more Taki coming soon? I know people are wanting more Taki.
Yes, Taki is working on 2 new projects that she just sold recently. That's all I can say.
Okay. All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to plug or any socials you want to highlight before we let you go?
I mean, you can find me anywhere on social media under just Oeming. I have a YouTube channel that has a lot of like tutorials and sort of art stuff behind it. And Galaxy Madness is a book coming out through Mad Cave, I think in June or July. Right now I'm just focusing on just what's immediately coming out. And just so people don't think I'm crazy, I'm not working on a billion books at once. It's usually 1 or 2 book at a time. And sometimes scheduling wise, they all come out together. So like the trade paperback for the collection of After Realm and Newbury and Galaxy of Madness and Blue Book and Murder Inc. and all that stuff, they're all done separately, but sometimes they come out at the same time.
You need to get into the ear of your collaborator, James Tynion, and tell him to follow your lead, because it seems like he's working on like 20 things at once.
James is amazing. He's great to work with too. And he's just as great as a person as he is a writer. So if you're a fan of his, just know that. Yeah, he's a great person too.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michael, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you here on the show at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.